I'm Farida Shaheed. I'm one of the ones with the white hair and the glasses to read. So we're on our way out. I have been part of the women's movement here since, I don't know, when was it, 77? Since I came back for my studies. I am currently working at Shilkutta, which is a Women's Resource Centre, which actually predates Women's Action Forum and helped to catalyze Women's Action Forum. It was started in 1975. I'm not going to speak about Shilkutta. I'm not going to speak actually about WAF either. I would like to put forward for all of our collective thoughts some of the findings of a research program that we had, that I know Bunny has constantly said that we're not sharing, but it will arrive in July. It has to do very much with the women's movement, with what we want, how we see ourselves moving forward. And I think one of the questions that has been central to the women's movement here as elsewhere is that if you are interested in more than jockeying for a better position within the existing system, we are talking about changing the system. And since systems are linked one to the other, we're not just talking about changing Lahore, Pakistan, South Asia, Asia, we're really talking about changing the entire globe. So it's not that we're not ambitious, but we like to do all of this with very little basis of power. And I think when we are talking about changing the system, whether we're talking about globalization, whether we're talking about nation states, whether we're talking about the market, the basic issue that the women's movement has to confront and to address and to find ways of intervening in is the whole issue of power and the dynamics of power, the structures of power that exist. So in a sense, the basic challenge is how do women who are powerless actually try and disrupt the entire power system and structures. Another issue that keeps cropping up, and we heard a little of it earlier on this afternoon, was the role of the state. And as feminists, it's an uncomfortable thing. The nation state, the state structure itself, the way it functions, is not something which is women-friendly. It is not something which encourages us to be a part of it, to restructure it to our liking. And I think these are some of the kinds of questions that led to a South Asia-based research program. And you'll see we're always ambitious. The program, I didn't call it this. It's called Women in Governance, Democratic Processes, Reimagining the State. The survey and the study took place in Bangladesh, Pakistan, 2 studies in India and Sri Lanka. In Pakistan, some of the findings or conclusions we came to, I'd like to present here. In Pakistan, one of the things we did was to carry out a national survey in rural and urban 4 provinces of the country, because we are forever being told that there are 50 of you mad women, we see you in the streets of Lahore or Karachi, you don't represent the women of Pakistan. So we decided that here we would mobilize enough information to be able to say that we have a fair statistical basis for this. In addition, there were about 21 focus group discussions with various women and a few with men, and 31 in-depth interviews of women. The interviews and focus group discussion was focused on women who we thought were more actively engaged in some way in the social and political environment in which they are located. We thought that the survey, because it was a random selected survey, would end up with a large part of women who are not necessarily politically or socially engaged in any way. So when I give you statistics, you're talking about the statistical average. When there are other conclusions, I will point them out. So what did we find? This is a survey that was completed in 1999. We were all hoping, I think, the researchers, to find that women had their own vision of the state. Unfortunately, not one of the studies in the whole South Asia region came up with women's alternative vision of the state. It's not imagined or conceptualized in any radically different form. It is seen as a given, as something that exists, it's not questioned. It is, however, also seen as falling far short of its obligation. The state institutions responsible for law and order and justice, which are all seen as being interconnected one to the other, are not approached by women, or only under extreme reluctance, and usually through male intermediaries. The state itself is not seen as a neutral entity. So when people say that women are incapable of analyzing, I think women are very capable of analyzing. In the discussions, it's clear, women talk about the differentiated treatment of citizens on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of religion, on the basis of class. Interestingly, they do not talk about the discrimination on the basis of gender. So that is missing theme from the discourses. The classes, the group identities, except for as women, are seen as either as the state not being neutral. Women do feel that the state has to be responsive and responsible in terms of providing for health and education and basic facilities. So the whole idea of the privatization today is not something that is shared by women's vision of what they would like to see. In terms of mobility, unsurprisingly, the differentiated rules that apply, there are certain things and certain communities have different rules for where and how you can be mobile. I don't want to get into the details of that. I do want to let you know, which I should have done first, we looked at various variables to see what differentiates women's perceptions and experiences of the state. Is it class? Is it education? We ran the regular marital status, etc. The regular socioeconomic factors were run through the computer. Nothing. We just couldn't believe that the rural-urban divide was so minimal. None of those came to the front until we started subdividing by provinces. It's when you subdivide by province that you find the differences of women's experiences and perceptions of the state. So a woman living in Sindh has a very different experience of that same state than a woman in the frontier, as Punjab, etc. Sindh, of course, is very divided in rural and urban Sindh, the two different entities. Frontier comes across as the most unified perceptions and experiences. So the differentiated rules and what you can do and not do, I think, are all recognized by women, they're described by women. And I think these have implications for our activism. In terms of decision making, I think it was clear that women do participate in some things, in some decisions, the education and marriage of their children being primary amongst these. They don't, however, decide about their own marriage. They don't, however, decide about property and financial matters. The state, as I said, is seen to be failing in its responsibilities to deliver services to the citizens. And in the face of that failure, you see people reverting to the traditional institutes or continuing to go back and rely on traditional forums, institutions that exist. Or, I would say, those traditional institutions, by which I mean the panchayat, the jirga, the chaudhry, the sardar, whoever locally has been the influence and negotiators on behalf of the community. Even if they are bad for women, they are proximate, they are known to the women, I would say that in the same category, it's the same role that is being fulfilled by political parties such as the MQM. When you are negotiating on behalf of the community with the state, getting better deals, dispute mediations in some of the M2M areas. I know no marriages could be held, no divorces were done without the approval of the local madras. It's very much the same thing as you look at the local community and you find that the panchayat or the jilga or whoever is in charge will make the decisions. Education is seen by women as being very, very important. But I have my doubts about that. As someone said earlier, some of the focus group discussions, women say we're oppressed because we have no education. Had we got more education, we would be able to intervene more. However, in the focus group discussions, you also find those voices who say, but whose education? What are we being taught through this education? Is it enough, and does it really help us fulfill our what we want? There is the whole question of participation in the political process. And one of the most telling things in this research to me was in the pre-survey asking women whether they're interested in politics. Women in one of the communities, this is the frontier, it so happens, it could be anywhere, I guess, said no, we're not interested. Several questions down the line, what do you discuss when you meet, when you group together? Well, they discuss Afghanistan, ex-Yugoslavia, India, etc. He said, excuse me, what do you define as politics? The definition of politics by these women is who wins a seat and who doesn't, and they couldn't care less who wins a seat and who doesn't. That is the definition of politics that they are rejecting. So when we are engaged in the struggle and we want women to become a part of the political process, you have to understand that we're talking about two very different things. The political process as parties and elections and standing is not something that many women are really intuitively keen to do. Yet women do vote. Only half of them said in the survey that they were interested in politics, and half of those were very interested, otherwise they were mindfully interested. More women vote than express an interest. And in Balochistan, the difference between how many people say that they're interested, how many women, and how many vote is 25%. So you're talking, and that is also where you have the highest pressure, where they accept that they are pressurized into voting in a certain way. So the fact that you have this vote does not say anything about you're actually expressing what it is that you want through that vote. A certain percentage of these votes are manipulated by men in the family, but equally, women say, by the local power elite in that area. So whether it's your Chaudhry or Sardar, or whether it's your local councillor of the last time, whoever it is. Religion, and I'll come back to this. I think this is a major area which we need to look at carefully. It's a very strange dynamics that operate, and I think we have to be careful in nuancing the different dynamics. When you talk about governance, when you talk about national issues, religion does not feature at all amongst women or amongst the men who were interviewed. This is not an issue. Good governance and a good government is not identified by whether you have Sharia bill or Sharia laws. I think there's 5% of women who say that 5% overall said that religion was a factor in governance, in good governance. All of them from the Punjab and NWFP. Sindh and Balochistan, this does not appear at all. Dispute resolutions. Who do you go to? Which institutions do you approach for help? Maulvi, 5% out of the 100. 5%, and what do you go to them for? You go to them for if your child is ill, if you want someone to learn the Quran. Women, however, with infertility somehow is linked to the Maulvi. Don't ask me why. Maybe the solution is. So these are the issues on which women do go to the Maulvi, otherwise he's not there. On the other hand, you ask them of useful institutions, 35% of the same women will say that the Maulvi is a useful institution. So you have a very strange, ambivalent kind of relationship, and I think that's something that we need to look at. Okay, some of the issues for the women's movement, since I have no time left. Let me put before you some of my favorite questions. I don't have the answers, and the research did not give them. So this is really questions that I think we need to think about together. It's very clear from this research, which is something one knows, has felt intuitively, that women live in different realities. Realities that are framed by ethnicity, by religion, by class, by age, by profession, by hundreds of other things that I imagine. The fact that your realities are disparate means to me that your responses need to be equally addressing the diversities amongst and between you. If we're to work as a women's movement together, we have to learn to address those and move together as a whole. Women also very clearly say that there's no one factor that will empower women. You can have education, you can have employment, you can have mobility, you can have this, but for any one given woman, two other factors may make that negative. So you may be allowed to go and work, but your mobility may be stopped. That does not empower you. So they see this very much as interdependent and interrelated. When we look at civil society, which is a popular term now, I think we have to recognize that NGOs and what we like to think of the progressive, however vaguely you define that, people who believe in human rights, who believe in democratic processes, participation, are not the only players in the field. And I think we have to try and address the other part of what we in Pakistan have started calling the uncivil society. Those who are prone to violence, who are armed, who have no belief in democratic processes, nevertheless are a force in civil society. When we talk about changing structures and shifting around the power base, I think it's clear that history so far has told us women haven't done so without finding allies. We need to identify who our allies are. And I think there was talk earlier about whether the left is an ally or not. I think we have to question whether those who we normally would naturally think of allies are the only allies and the best allies. I know the women's movement in Pakistan, we were forever told by people who we would consider our natural allies, we went on the demonstration, well done, great, you did it for the wrong cause. Now do it again for democracy. Do it again for something else. So I think there's an uneasy relationship that we need to explore and look at. Women's rights and the state. I know this is something which, those of you who have heard me know that this is something which bothers me. Women's rights, women's movements are far too dependent on the state to provide the changes that they're looking for in women's lives on the ground. We criticize that state for being unresponsive and unhelpful to women, yet we ask the state to change its policies. We expect the state to change and to assist us by affirmative actions, by whatever. I think we have to be very careful about that. We found out when the state decides to move from liberal to completely anti-women under Ziaul, we found out the problems that you face in that. I think the other question that is linked to this is, as a women's movement, we tend to look at legal rights and work on the legal and policy rights area much more than we work on the day-to-day changing women's lives at the grassroots. Somehow we have to be able to link those two movements together, those two types of activism, to really make a difference. And one of my final ones, I guess, is there's no clear articulation of what an appropriate feminist state looks like, what a feminist world looks like. And this question now, I repeated for several years. I will continue to repeat it until someone comes up with an answer or I find some way to address it myself. We talk about being non-hierarchical. Nobody has the answer to what a non-hierarchical state looks like. What does a non-hierarchical, collective, participatory, global economy look like? Well, I think we have to start thinking about it. Because until we have some of these answers, we talk about legitimacy of power and illegitimacy. What does the feminist movement consider an appropriate political system? And what is a legitimate way of, what are the routes to political power that we would consider legitimate? How would legitimate political power operate, regulate itself, and yet remain feminist? These are questions that, as we move into the globalization, that leaves me with one more last point, which is globalization. I think is important. I don't think we can get away from it, but I am surprised when I go to a meeting and somebody says, shouldn't the women's movement on violence against women start cooperating with the movement on globalization? Now, to me, I find this very strange as a question. To me, there is a women's movement, and yes, we're varied and different and whatever, but there should be no question of whether you collaborate within the women's movement just because you are working on different issues. So we need to sort of move beyond that. The other question, however, is that we continue to lobby our state for changes. That state no longer is making many of the decisions. So we are lobbying for political power in a state which is losing its power of decision making. It's a challenge not just for the women's movement, but for all social movements. I think the last comment is just commenting on MAF, or not sort of commenting on MAF, but I think we have to remember, it comes back, the women's movement has to be a political movement.